And we're continuing with the fourth chapter of Silver on the Tree, Midsummer Day. The father of the boy that Stephen threw in the river for beating up on the Indian kid has kind of come to see what's what with the family, and Mr. Stanton and he are kind of having a heart-to-heart where several very racist things have been said by the gentleman who has come calling on the Stanton's farm. Barbara said in the same polite voice, "I expect some of your best friends are Indians and Pakistanis." Her father gave her a sharp warning glance, but the words went flickering quite over Mr. Moore's stubbly head. He chuckled at Barbara, very much the jovial male indulging a pretty 17-year-old. "Well, no, I wouldn't go that far. I'll be honest with you, I don't think they should be here. Them or the West Indians got no right, have they, taking jobs that should go to Englishmen, with the country and the state it is," Stephen said quietly. We do have unions, Mr. Moore, and they aren't exactly helpless. Most of those famous jobs are the ones Englishmen don't want to do, or that the immigrants do better." The man looked at Stephen with resentment and dislike, his thick jaw hardening. "One of those, are you? A bleeding heart? Don't try and teach me, young man. I've seen too much of the real thing. One packy fellow rents a 2-bedroom house, and the next thing you know, they got 16 of their friends and relations living there like rabbits, and half of them having babies free on the National Health Service and the British taxpayers' expense." "Remember your Indian doctor?" Stephen said, still stiffly. "If it weren't for the immigrant doctors and nurses, the National Health Service would fall apart tomorrow." Mr. Moore made a contemptuous noise. Don't try and tell me about colored people," he said. "I know." Stephen leaned back against the wall, twisting a piece of raffia between his fingers. "Do you know Calcutta, Mr. Moore?" he said. "Have you ever had beggars grabbing at your feet, calling out to you, children half the size of Will here, with an arm missing or an eye, and ribs like xylophones, and their legs stinking with sores? If I lived in a place like that, if I lived in a place with that kind of despair around me, I think I just might decide to bring my kids to a country where they'd have a better chance, especially a country that had exploited my own for about 200 years. Wouldn't you? Or Jamaica now? Do you know how many children get to a secondary school there? Do you know the unemployment rate? Do you know what the slums are like in Kingston? Do you know—" "Stephen," said his father gently. Stephen stopped. The raffia string in his hand snapped. So what about it, all that stuff?" The man's face had darkened. He leaned belligerently out of the window. His breath came more quickly. "Let them solve their own problems, not come whining over here. What's all that have to do with us? They don't belong here, none of them. They should be thrown out, and if you think they're so bloody marvelous, you'd better go and live in their lousy countries with them." He caught Mr. Stanton's calm eye suddenly and tried visibly to control himself, jerking his head back from the window and sliding across into the driver's seat. Mr. Stanton came close to the wall where the car stood and took his pipe from his mouth. If your son shares your views, Mr. Moore, he said clearly, as I am glad to find my son shares mine, then the stream episode isn't hard to explain, is it? We only have to decide what reparation you'd like." The pipe went back between his teeth abruptly. "Reparation? Hell!" The man started his engine with a deliberate roar. He leaned over the seat, shouting above the noise, "You just see what happens to anyone laying a finger on my boy again for the sake of some snivelling little wog. That's all, just see." He lurched back at the wheel and drove off, gears snarling. They stood looking after the car. Stephen opened his mouth. "Don't say it," said his father. "Don't say it. You know how many there are. You can't convince them, and you can't kill them. You can only do your best in the opposite direction, which you did." He looked around, embracing Will and Barbara in a rueful smile. "Come on, let's go and have tea." Will came last, trailing despondently. From the moment when he had heard the man in the car begin to shout and had seen the look in his eyes, he had been no Stanton at all, but wholly an old one, dreadfully and suddenly aware of danger. The mindless ferocity of this man and all those like him, their real loathing born of nothing more solid than insecurity and fear. It was a channel. Will knew that he had been gazing into the channel down which the powers of the dark, if they gained their freedom, could ride in an instant to complete control of the earth. He was filled with a terrible anxiety. a sense of urgency for the light, and knew that it would remain with him, silently shouting at him far more vividly than the fading memory of a single bigot like Mr. Moore. "Come on, Townsend," said Paul, thumping his bare shoulder as he came past out of the house. So Will came back, slowly, into the other part of his mind. They all gathered for tea, as though the disturbing Mr. Moore had never been. But one of those unspoken censorships that came sometimes in close families, those that have seen him made no mention of him to those who had not. Tea was laid out on the orange wicker table, glass-topped, that stood outdoors, with its matching chairs in high summer. Will's spirits began to rise. For an old one, with the tastes and appetites of a small boy, it was hard to despair for long over the internal fallibility of mankind when confronted with homemade bread, farm butter, sardine and tomato paste, raspberry jam, scones, and Mrs. Stanton's delicious, delicate, unmatchable sponge cake. He sat in the grass. His senses were crammed with summer. The persistent zooming of a wasp, lured by the jam. The grass smell of James's partly cut lawn mingling with the scent of a nearby buddleia bush. The dappled light all around him. The sunshine filtered through the apple tree overhead, lush in full green leaf now, with small green apples beginning to swell. Many of the apples were fallen already, victims of overpopulation, never to grow. Will picked up one of the little thick-stemmed oval objects and gazed at it pensively. "Put it down," Barbara said. "This'll taste better." She was holding out a plate with 2 scones spread thickly with butter and jam. "Hey," said Will, "thanks." It was a small, warm kindness. In a family as big as the Stantons, self-sacrifice was the general rule. Barbara smiled at him briefly, and Will could sense her formless maternal concern that her youngest brother had been upset by the violence of the man in the car. His spirits lifted. The old one within him thought, "The other side. Don't forget, there's always the other side of people, too." 3.5 more weeks for school," James said in a tone that was half delight, half grumble. He looked up at the sky. "I hope the holidays all like this." "The long-range forecast is it will begin pouring with rain the day you break up," said Paul seriously, folding a piece of bread and butter. He went on through a mouthful. "It's due to go on for 3 weeks without stopping, except once for August weekend." "Oh, no!" said James in unguarded horror. Paul looked at him owlishly over his horn-rimmed glasses. "There may very well be hail, and on the last day of July they're expecting a blizzard." James's face relaxed into a grin as relief twined with shamefaced rage. "Paul, you swine, I'll—" "Don't kill him," Stephen said. "Too fatiguing, bad for digestion. Tell me what you're going to do for the holidays instead." "Scout camp some of the time," said James happily. 2 weeks in Devon. Very nice, too. "I'm doing summer courses at the academy and playing in a jazz club at night," Paul said with a crooked grin. "Good Lord!" "Ah, the worm turns. Not exactly your kind of jazz, though. Better known out." "What are you going to do, Will?" "Loaf about, like me," said Barbara comfortably from an armchair. "Well, as a matter of fact," Mrs. Stanton said, "Will has an invitation he hasn't heard about yet. Quite a surprise." She leaned forward with the teapot and began filling cups. "Your Aunt Jen telephoned this afternoon from London. She and David are up for a day or two with some group from Wales, and she wanted to know, Will, if you'd like to spend part of the holidays at the farm. As soon as school ends, if you like," Will said slowly. "That's good." "Wow," said James. "Don't tell Mary. She'll be livid. She thought she was going to be invited back to Wales this year." "Jed said something about Will getting along very well last year with a rather lonely boy who lived there," Mrs. Stanton said. "Yes," said Will. "Yes, I did. His name was Bran." "You'll have to make sure it's a working holiday, you know," said his father. "Make yourself useful to your uncle. I know that part of Wales is almost all sheep, but it's a busy time of year on any farm." "Oh, yes," Will said. He picked up another of the small, immature apples and twirled it round and round fast by its stem. "Yes, there'll be a lot of work to do." And that is the end of chapter 4, and it is the end of part 1.